Council is deeply grateful to the Bank of America and especially Joe Caraquel, Director of Global Government Division of the bank. Joe is a WAC DC member of the board of our board of directors and makes it possible for us to be here each year. And I'd also like to thank the Lee and Juliet Folger Fund for their support of the Summer Institute for about 20 years now. In addition, we would like to thank the Embassy of the Kingdom of Bahrain for their gracious hospitality tomorrow, where we will be their guests for lunch and a discussion with the Ambassador, Her Excellency Huda Nanu. Our speakers deserve special thanks for taking the time from their schedules to share their expertise and understanding with us. And last but not least, I want to thank the Council staff and interns who make this all work on a day-to-day basis. Amanda, Stephanie, Scott, and our wonderful interns, and you'll be interacting with all of them this week. Increasingly, Americans are coming to understand the importance and the necessity of becoming citizens of the world. Teaching about current events is tough, not only because events continue to evolve and the news reporting varies widely in content and value and geographic location, but because the day is only so long. Oftentimes, teachers must devise for themselves ways of introducing current global issues into their classrooms. I don't need to tell any of you that. We are here to help you with that effort. The role of the United States as the world's sole superpower is evolving rapidly, and as we struggle to end this nation's longest-running war, it has been demonstrated to us, as it has to others before us, that even a superpower has its limits militarily, financially, and politically. During the last two Summer Institutes, we have examined the global economy and the Arab Spring. We are in the midst of tectonic shifts in global affairs. The financial crisis that began in 2008 is still with us today, and we are still dealing with its aftermath. The euro crisis is on the front page nearly every day, threatening further damage to the world's fragile economic health and to slow U.S. recovery even more, if not push us into another recession. This week, we will hear from experts on the euro crisis, the political and economic developments in Asia, the implications of global warming for food, for health, for migration. Tomorrow, we will visit the Embassy of the Kingdom of Bahrain for lunch with the ambassador, as I mentioned. Bahrain is caught up in protests and a violent struggle by significant numbers of its population demanding far greater rights and freedoms. So far, unlike what we saw in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and eventually probably we'll see in Syria, in Bahrain, the Sunni monarchy has managed to retain power over a Shia majority. We will hear from one of this nation's foremost experts on cybersecurity, the Honorable Frank Kramer, and about non-proliferation issues from Joe Cirincione, about national security, pandemics, failed states, drone warfare, and much more. It's a full week, and one filled with the issues of our day and with discussions of how to help your students apply critical thinking skills to their new world. So let us begin. This morning, we are privileged to have a keynote address by Ambassador William Courtney. His topic, Global Themes 2012 and Introduction, will set us on our journey through the week. In the course of his distinguished career in the Foreign Service, Ambassador Courtney was directly involved in a number of the issues we will examine during the course of this seminar. Ambassador Courtney was the first U.S. Commissioner to the Bilateral Consultative Commission, which implements the Threshold Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. In 1991-92, he co-chaired the U.S. delegation in initial talks with the USSR and then Russia on the safety, security, and dismantlement of nuclear weapons. They helped pave the way for the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. Earlier, he was deputy negotiator in the U.S.-Soviet defense and space talks in Geneva, National Security Council deputy executive secretary, special assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and deputy director of the State Department's Office of Strategic Nuclear Policy. In 1998-99, he helped manage the reorganization of the foreign affairs agencies, including the integration into state of the former U.S. Information Agency and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Earlier, Ambassador Courtney was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of the NSC staff for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. He served as ambassador to Georgia and was the first ambassador to Kazakhstan. He led negotiations to eliminate strategic nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan the first post-Soviet state to do so. Ambassador Courtney attended West Virginia Wesleyan College and graduated from West Virginia University with a BA and Brown University with a PhD in economics. Today, he is Director of Strategy and Development of the Computer Sciences Corporation, a global leader in providing technology-enabled business solutions and services. We are very fortunate to have him here today to discuss the world with us, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Bill Courtney.
Thank you. It's great to hear all of the various things that you're doing. This discussion will try to cover a number of issues around the world, mainly to excite your interest. And then feel free to jump in during the discussion as you like, focusing on areas of special interest. Because this is a fairly broad discussion, and there's probably some things here that are going to be more important for you than others. Does this work? This?
No, you should be good. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. All right.
Might have just a little lag.
Global themes. Oh, wait a minute. It's growing automatically. Okay, the contents. We'll first talk about a few international relations concepts. How can we stop it now?
Oh, is it?
I don't know.
Let's see.
Okay, it's okay for the time being now. I pressed that, but it wouldn't go through. Does it need to be pointed at something?
It should be, the thing's right there, so it should be okay.
Oh,
I think, okay, maybe I had it backwards.
Okay.
There we go.
Oh, great. Okay, terrific. Okay, so we'll talk about some basic concepts, issues, and then a few final thoughts. There are 6 concepts I'd like to go over, and a number of you are going to know more about some of these things than I do because of the things that you, oh no, there we go again. Okay. The first is often in international affairs, people, I don't know, how can we just stop it?
Happens to us all the time.
All right. That should be it.
All right, thank you. So the first two are often seen as contrasts, if you will. Realism. Henry Kissinger was known to be, in our time, an exponent of realistic politics. That is, not spending too much time thinking about moral issues, but rather what's realistic on the ground that you can actually negotiate. He did shuttle diplomacy between the Arab world and Israel, for example, and trying to find a solution that might not be a perfect solution for Israel or for Egypt or whatever, according to some basic principle, like, say, the Zionist principle or Arab principles, but something that could be realistic and worked on the ground. Idealism we often associate with Woodrow Wilson, and that's morphed over time into something sometimes called liberal internationalism. But idealism is the notion that you really should pursue things that are good, that are just, that are often sweeping in their powers. In our time, human rights has become something that was seen as idealism when it started. President Jimmy Carter gave initial impetus to human rights being a bigger part of our diplomacy. Before that, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, after World War II, she had played a key role in the United Nations arena for that. But Jimmy Carter started the modern emphasis on human rights. But now, human rights has become realism. So, for example, when we press Bashar Assad in Syria to step down, we're invoking principles of human rights that are realistic, because those principles help us marshal international support for sanctions against Syria. So the distinction between realism and idealism sometimes depends on time, as in human rights. Sometimes it will depend on circumstances. In the Arab world, for example, the U.S. has given less emphasis to human rights and women's rights in some areas than it did in the former Soviet Union. Because with the former Soviet Union, we thought we could help bring down the Soviet system by emphasizing human rights. And indeed, that turned out to be true. But we've gone more slowly in the Arab world, primarily because the governments over there were stable and we needed their cooperation in other areas. So the choice between realism and idealism is very real in some contexts. It's certainly very real if you take Saudi Arabia, for example, or how they deal with women's rights and human rights. Oftentimes, though, the two go together. Okay, now let's try it. Okay, the other, there are two other concepts that are often seen as opposite, isolationism and internationalism. And here again, this can be time dependent. In the years leading up to World War II, isolationism was very strong sentiment here in the United States. So much so that Franklin Roosevelt promised a number of times, that we wouldn't send our soldiers over to Europe, that we would stay away from Europe's conflicts, that we would remain neutral, that our shipping should remain neutral, for example. But as time went on and Nazi aggression became greater, then he began shifting, saying, well, we won't be sending our troops, but we'll send supplies to Great Britain, for example, so that they can fight. And he used the metaphor of, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you will lend them your hose so he can put out his fire rather than you're having to do it yourself. But that worked for a while, and then after the Pearl Harbor, and then gratuitously a few days later, Hitler declared war on the United States, and so then, of course, at that point, we engaged with our people. So Americans' attitudes to isolationist attitudes, if you will, were strong before World War II, but as events changed, things developed, and then, of course, we became very internationalist, if you will. Third, a newer set of concepts, or at least the name, soft power and hard power. Joe Nye, who was dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard, invented this concept. And it's not a new concept in some sense. In fact, he and Bob Cohen wrote a book in the mid-'70s called something like Transnational Issues. And basically what they argued was, after détente started in the Soviet Union, and so there was some lessening of international pressure, that more issues were coming to the fore that were international issues that didn't really involve military power. So, for example, law of the sea treaty began to be negotiated in those days. International monetary arrangements became more important after we floated the dollar in 1971, for example. So there was an argument that, well, balance of power politics, or realism, if you will, in the traditional hard power sense, was less important. Well, then it turned out that things changed, and hard power did become more important in, for example, having to deal with the arms challenges from the former Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, and of course the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, other things. So today, there's a wider understanding that every state has to use some instruments of hard power and some instruments of soft power. The mix will depend. Smaller or weaker states tend to give more emphasis to soft power because that's what they have. States that are either stronger or more inclined tend to give more emphasis relative to hard power. So, for example, the Europeans and European Union in general, in recent decades, they've tended to specialize more in soft power. They've tended not to want to build big militaries and go off and fight foreign wars. The United Kingdom is a little bit of an exception because they've been with us in most of the wars. The U.S. has tended to be the repository of hard power. A lot of Europeans still see the United States as their ultimate security guarantor. A lot of other Europeans don't think they need an ultimate security guarantor. They don't think the U.S. nuclear weapons umbrella, if you will, is their ultimate guarantor. Japan, as China has risen, North Korean threats, Japan has become more interested in recent years in the U.S. nuclear umbrella, which is our hard power. Japan, because of its history, its unfortunate history in East Asia, has tended to deploy only instruments of soft power, and they have not wanted to deploy military forces beyond their borders, although we are, interestingly, urging them to do more. To give one example, the sea lines of communication. China depends a lot, and Japan depend a lot on oil from the Persian Gulf, and Europe has tended to depend a lot. We don't depend so much on oil from the Persian Gulf, but it's our ships, our airplanes, that are the ultimate security guarantee for those long sea lines of communication for oil coming out of the Persian Gulf going to world markets. Okay, so we have kind of 6 concepts. Any questions about those concepts before we look at some specific regional situations? No? Okay. All right, let's go. First, Arab-Israeli peace. This has been the most frustrating issue for presidents. Almost every president comes to power and says, by gosh, we're going to make a strong effort to solve the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli. So there's a wider issue and then a more narrow issue. But it's been frustrating. President Clinton came fairly close, offered a pretty good deal to Yasser Arafat, but Arafat backed away from the deal. It turned out that public opinion polling showed that the Palestinians still preferred to confront Israel rather than make peace with Israel. Israel has continued to build settlements in the West Bank, which outrages Arabs and Palestinians, but it increases Israel's leverage in negotiations. And the U.S. publicly has urged Israel not to do that, but as a practical matter, it does build more leverage for Israel in negotiations. In this administration, really not so much has been done on Arab-Israeli issues. China, of course, China's rise is something that everyone talks about. My family, we all shop at Walmart. Virtually everything there is from China. One of the interesting things about China is, on the one hand, you'll see politicians inveighing against offshoring. It's sometimes called outsourcing, but it's actually called offshoring, where production is sent abroad. So, for example, when I was a youngster, there was a lot of clucking of tongues in America about the movement of textile factories from New England down to the South. A lot of people thought this was anti-labor union. They were taking advantage of cheap labor or child labor in the South or whatever. Well, those textile factories are in Mexico or Malaysia or China or some other place now. So it's been a constant process of shifting. China has probably more offshoring, if you will, than any other country. It's not a majority of its gross domestic product, but it's a very large factor. As you may have seen the story about iPhones and iPads, which were all built in China, Apple was relying on a company over there, an offshore company, I forget what the name of it is now, Foxconn. Foxconn has something like 30,000 engineers. No company in the U.S. has 30,000 engineers. It's a phenomenal amount of engineers. But offshoring has worked very well. The American consumer benefits enormously with low prices, from blue jeans from China and Walmart to iPads. So the consumer benefits are very strong. But in political discourse, most of the discussion is about, shipping jobs overseas. Well, those jobs go overseas because of economics, not because of some particular political will. So China is extremely strong now as an exporter of goods, but recently we've seen China throw its weight around a little bit more, particularly in the South China Sea, which is, despite the name, a sea where I think half the world shipping goes through that sea. It's just the route around Southeast Asia. below China. And so the U.S. is deploying a little bit more naval capability over there. And earlier this year, President Obama announced that there will be a pivot in U.S. foreign policy toward the Asia Pacific. That's partly to counter Chinese power and also to discourage China from taking undue risks, let's say, and trying to intimidate neighbors. Next is Africa. Of course, the two parts of Africa, the Arabs in North Africa and blacks in sub-Saharan Africa. A number of African countries have actually grown reasonably well in more recent years. It's not, a total failed area. On the other hand, some of the worst failed states are in Africa. Somalia, Sudan have been interesting examples of those. The U.S. traditionally has not, has probably given less emphasis to Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. American blacks have not made Africa a big cause célèbre. Unlike Hispanics, who have a significant influence on U.S. policy toward Latin America, American blacks don't typically have a strong influence on U.S. policy toward Africa. It hasn't really made much difference. The biggest single thing that the U.S. has done with Africa in recent years was George W. Bush's HIV/AIDS assistance program called PEPFAR. The Bush administration came up with an initiative to spend billions of dollars for treatment. It's a word which I can't think of right now, but for clinics and health facilities and antiretroviral drugs for initial emphasis of 14 countries, of which maybe 11 or 12 are in Africa, because of very high rates of HIV/AIDS infection. And that's been a phenomenally successful program. It's been very expensive, but it's had bipartisan support. But by and large, it did not come because American blacks decided, by gosh, this is something the U.S. ought to do. It really came more out of the tradition of humanitarian aid, which has always had a strong element in U.S. policy. Latin America. Oh, sorry, yes.
Is there a particular reason you feel, that takes place, that black African Americans are not pro-African like you are related to the Spanish in Latin America?
Part of it may be distance in time.
Yeah.
People here came here a long time ago. So let's take an analog, German Americans.
Yeah.
German Americans are really not an influence in U.S. foreign policy anymore. They mostly came here a long time ago and they've blended in so much so. The more recent immigrants, so if you take East European immigrants, my wife is a Ukrainian American. Her family came over in displaced persons camps after World War II from Ukraine and came over here. East European politics are still very strong. There's a Central and East European coalition here in Washington of 23 East European groups. I'm a little bit involved with them indirectly. They're actively up there on the Hill lobbying. They used to lobby for what were called captive nations resolutions when the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire still existed. But they're up there lobbying for assistance for Ukraine. Armenian Americans are very strong, and so they lobby for Armenian American citizens. German Americans just don't do that sort of thing. And, this hasn't been a big issue in the black community as well.
I would tend to think would it be the way African Americans were brought here and the distance in between of becoming involved in such a way as other countries have. It's an interesting thought. I've never really a consideration of considering the lobbying on behalf of African Americans. I know they did involve in South Africa for Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
So that was I think that to say that they never get involved, right. That was a totally, I think that piece was very focused. They
were very involved, but again, America's overall humanitarian instinct played, I think, still the dominant role in South Africa because good and evil were so clearly defined in that circumstance. With East Europeans here, because so many came after World War II, they have family members over there,
Yes.
and so that keeps the fires burning alive. With German Americans, probably not so many or have family members that they stay closely in
I was
touch
going
with.
to say that's the same thing for African Americans.
Same for African Americans,
Okay.
because it's so long ago.
Yeah.
Yes.
What is the degree of influence of the Jewish Americans on Israel and the Palestinian conflict? Because American policy is very much influenced by
Yes.
Jewish American thought.
Absolutely, very much. Foreign policy in general is very much susceptible to domestic politics. So if you have a strong, strident group here that feels very strongly, even though they're small in number, they can make an enormous amount of difference. And let me give you an example I'm familiar with. Georgia. The Russians, Russians invaded Georgia in August 2008. There are, 2,000 Georgians in America. A number of them are students over here studying and things like that. But John Shalishkashvili, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was half Georgian by background. There have been some other reasons why Georgia has become important. So when the Russians invaded Georgia, John McCain stood up in the Senate, and Joe Biden, they really hit Russia hard. One Republican, one Democrat, because of how they're mistreating little innocent Georgia. That's different from the Israeli situation. But in between those are the Armenian Americans. Armenian Americans tend to be well educated. Many of them are concentrated in Southern California. So Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein, the two senators from California, can be counted upon to support any Armenian-related activity. On the other hand, Turkey has been an extremely important ally in NATO for us, and it's very important economically. Right now it's on the front line with Syria, for example, and the U.S. and Turkish cooperation is very important. So Armenian Americans have not captured U.S. foreign policy toward that region, but they've had a major impact on it. For Jews in America, many more Jews than Armenians. They also tend to be prosperous, to give a lot in political campaigns like Armenian Americans do, and they've had an enormous impact. So at the bottom here I say U.S. policy is to guarantee Israel's defense. We do not have a security treaty with Israel the way we do with NATO. NATO treaty is an attack on one is considered to be an attack on all. We don't have a treaty with Israel that way. But that's what we would do because there's so much support here. And then you have a lot of evangelical Christians here who believe Israel is good and honorable, deserves full support. So it's not just Jews in America, it's broader. The Armenians don't have anybody else who really cares much about Armenia, but Israel does. So yeah, it has a huge impact. Let's see, were we on?
We're just finishing Africa.
Yeah,
Okay, all right. So in the northern part of Africa, the Arab Springs. I got started in Tunisia, which tends to have more civil society. By civil society, I mean, independent, private-owned business, non-governmental organizations, people who are willing to speak up. And so Tunisia is on its way to becoming, reasonable, maybe democracy fairly soon. It's a lot tougher, as we see in Egypt, although a very positive step has just taken place with the militaries. Clearly reluctant approval of Morsi as the new president of the country. And while the Egyptian generals have issued a decree saying that they're going to be responsible for a whole bunch of security policy and veto power over other things, Morsi hasn't challenged them directly. But as they either reconstitute the old parliament or elect a new parliament, the Islamists are going to gain more and more power, and the military are going to fall away. I see that as quite positive because countries need to begin developing political experience on their own, and they're going to make missteps at the beginning, as we did with our Articles of Confederation, or the discrimination against blacks in the Constitution. Was it in the Constitution? Was it in the Constitution? I forgot. Okay. Or not allowing women to vote. So we made a lot of missteps at the beginning. But this is real political life in Egypt. And Egypt has always considered itself to be kind of the cultural capital of learning in the Arab world. So it's going to be a little messy for a while, but it may not be all bad in the end. Okay, Latin America, again, lots of immigrants, recent immigrants. Immigration is the issue that lots of Americans think of first when it comes to Latin America. But after the financial crisis, suddenly immigration dropped off, illegal immigration dropped off now. And I think there are even some net outflows or something, I'm not exactly sure, but it's changed a lot. But political candidates, when you hear them, all political candidates say, well, border security first. Got to guarantee the border before you have immigration reform. Well, that border cannot be, I'm sorry, not guaranteed, sealed. You've got to seal the border. That border cannot be sealed. Physically, it's just too long, it's too difficult to do, and the Department of Homeland Security has stumbled several times in trying new solutions with towers, with television cameras, and radios, and all sorts of, it's very hard. But the practical matter is, as our economy recovers, there's going to be an upsurge again in illegal immigration. We have to do what we can with the border, but we have to find some solution to lots of people who've been here for a long time. And President Obama did a great thing the other day with implementing through administrative measures as much as he could of what was the proposed DREAM Act that has not gone through Congress. But we have to get realistic about immigration in America. And we have a shortage of labor in a lot of industries. I am told that the milk industry in America, that 60% of the people who work in the milk industry are not fully legal. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm told that. I was at an event once where a representative of the milk industry, this is an event on immigration, was talking about, hey, we have to be careful about what we do because the milk industry depends a lot. So this is a complex issue, but we have to come to grips with it. While we mentioned here that lots of left-wing parties have been coming to power recently, Latin America actually, much of it's done reasonably well in recent years. Brazil's a real dynamo. Mexico's actually done well, although the narcotics problem is becoming more severe. But Latin America has generally been a positive spot. India, still pervasive poverty, and India's circumstance, Indira Gandhi and a lot of the people in the interwar period, between World War I and World War II, studied in London at the London School of Economics, and socialist economics was very strong. And they went back and implemented socialist economics, and as a result, India was stagnant for a long period of time. It had state-owned industries, state-owning means of production, which is socialism. They were stagnant for a very long period of time, leaving that very multi-ethnic democracy in peril until 1991, I think it was, yeah. And then they started making real economic reforms, and suddenly things have gotten a lot better. Lots of U.S. companies now offshore over there, call centers, as you know. I work for a computer company. We have 20,000 people in India. They do software engineering. At first, they could only do very defined problems in software engineering because students had very rote learning experiences in school. They couldn't think independently the way Americans tend to do. But now that's changed. Now you can give them complex software engineering problems, and they can address that. So they're coming up. Syria, probably the biggest single foreign policy challenge for the United States right now. This dispute between realism and idealism, soft power, hard power, all these things come to bear in the Syrian situation. Syria was part of a French mandate. The French tend to know more, have been more involved about Syria than we have. Turkey is the frontline state. As with Libya, where France and Great Britain took the lead and we supported them, we led from within as opposed to some critics who say we led from behind, but we actually led from within. it was a strategic interest for France, Italy, and Great Britain to solve the Libyan situation, and it did. Syria is a lot more complex. In Iraq, there was a Sunni minority that ruled a Shia majority. In Syria, you have an Alawite, which is Shia-like, minority ruling a Sunni majority. And so the Sunnis are the biggest part of the opposition. Europeans and Americans are reluctant to get too involved because it may just turn out to be a messy civil war like Iraq. On the other hand, this issue about realism versus idealism. Now, the latest incarnation of idealist thinking, if you will, is now called responsibility to protect, R2P. R2P. And after we sat, in the international community, sat still and allowed hundreds of thousands of people to be butchered in Rwanda in the 90s, and then in Bosnia allowed a lot of people to be butchered before Europeans and Americans really intervened there. This shameful passivity, if you will, has helped build momentum behind the notion of responsibility to protect. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave it a big push, and now it's a big push. So in the Libyan situation, for example, you had realists, for example, U.S. military leaders who, many military officers thought, Libya's not a strategic interest to the U.S. Our territory is not threatened by what's going on in Libya, if you will. And then you had idealists. Hillary Clinton was been widely reported in the press. A woman named Samantha Power in the National Security Council staff who wrote a book on genocide that became quite well known. They, and Susan Rice up at the UN ambassador, they were, according to the press, reported to be the idealists, if you will, urging responsibility to protect, that we had to protect civilians in Libya. That debate has been a little more muted now with Syria because it's so complex. Black and white were a little easier with Libya. Going after Gaddafi was seen as a simpler exercise. Yes.
Is it not about oil and resources? I mean, that's what we're after in terms of protecting that asset.
Not in Syria doesn't have much.
That's my point.
Yeah.
So the reason that we did sort of have this dialogue about protecting in Libya was because of also the resource that was there. That resource is not in Syria, therefore there's not as much dialogue about the responsibility to protect.
Indirectly, there was probably some element of that, but the main reason we got involved was our closest NATO allies regarded it as a strategic interest. So we went to bat because France, Britain, and Italy wanted us to.
To protect oil.
Partly, but it's more than just oil, although they rely on a lot of oil from Libya. There's a lot of the humanist concern in Europe has grown quite strong. So this responsibility to protect people in Europe, think that's important. They're not so keen to have their military go enforce it sometimes, but they think it's important. So it was significantly humanitarian. Because the oil was coming before and it will be coming afterwards. It was more of a humanitarian effort, and we did it mainly because they wanted to do it. Now in Syria, it's just so complex over there. For example, the Christians in Syria, I think, are 10% or something like that. They're afraid for the Alawite regime to fall because they're afraid of what the Sunnis will do. But how much butchery does Assad have to commit before some of the other minorities are going to be saying, well, wait a minute, he's gone too far and too many people are being killed, artillery's being fired into cities, and civilians are killed indiscriminately. So it's a lot more complex. Yes?
What's been the political response of the other Middle East countries to what's going on, particularly Israel, since Israel is almost isolated against the other countries, but how are they responding to Syria?
Israel would like Syria to fall because Syria, with its Alawite minority, which is they're close to Shia, has been an agent of Iran, if you will, and sponsored Hezbollah. Iran sponsors Hezbollah via Syria. So Israel would be happy to see the Alawite regime go. But it's basically ducked low in this. because there are complexities over there, and they're a little bit concerned too about something may be unintended consequences of it as well. So they have not played the major role. If they were to play the major role, then it would be harder for other Arabs to gang up on Syria. So I think the Israelis realize it's best to stay quiet, and the Sunni Arabs, now led by the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in particular, have been aiding the opposition with military and other activities, and so are pushing harder. Any other questions on this? Okay. Iran. Big issue here, of course, is nuclear weapons program. They have a very elaborate nuclear weapons program. It's not totally clear that they've definitely decided to build nuclear weapons, but it's hard to explain their program by any other rationale than that they are committed to have nuclear weapons. Even under the Shah, before 1979, a lot of Iranians thought they were a big power amid an area that was, more Shia in the Persian Gulf, if you will, and that if Pakistan, India were going to have nuclear weapons, they were a big power, they should have nuclear weapons to protect their sort of great power status in the region. The negotiations have gone poorly for a long period of time. Countries have been unwilling to put pressure on Iran for a long period of time. When President Obama came into office, he said, well, I'll extend a hand to negotiate with Iran for a year. Well, nothing happened. And so only in the last minute now, where the Iranians are very close to getting nuclear weapons, have the Europeans and Americans and others in the international community been able to marshal support for tough economic sanctions on Iran. So it may be too late to do that, and therefore Israel and the U.S. have both considered military options. President Obama, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta have both said nuclear weapons are unacceptable in Iran. Well, when you use language like that in international affairs, it means you're willing to use force to achieve it. Russia is weakened now that Vladimir Putin has come back to formal power as president, and he's trying to push Russia's, let's say, respect for Russia's power, particularly in its former Soviet neighbors around. And the invasion of Georgia in 2008 really shocked Europe and America, and people were outraged that Russia behaved that way again. Russia may try those measures again, but it found the reaction in 2008 kind of strong. Sorry, I forgot nuclear weapons.
The press made a lot of the body language between the president and Putin at the G20 in Mexico. Is it the cold shoulder, or they both were, the president was at peace with Russia and China's answer on Syria, or their help of Putin is playing hardball, or just don't want to get involved or help the world solve the Syrian problem?
The president has pursued a reset policy with Russia to try to improve relations, and they got a new START treaty, which was a fairly modest accomplishment, actually. Got Russian cooperation to ship supplies to our troops in Afghanistan, to NATO forces in Afghanistan through what's called the Northern Distribution Network, which became more important as Pakistan put restrictions on shipping supplies up through Pakistan to our forces in Afghanistan. But we've struggled for years in getting Russia to put pressure on Iran on the nuclear program. They've finally done more, but still they do it reluctantly. And of course on Syria they've been most reluctant. The Russians argue that the UN resolution they approved for Libya to protect people actually turned into a regime change thing, that the West betrayed them, if you will, and so they don't want to let that happen again. But Russia really is a country with no friends, and no soft power is very weak from Russia. And so Bashar Assad and the Iranians are kind of the last friends Russia has, and neither of them is really a reliable friend, but Russia's reluctant to lose friends. And then even more important, Russia is reluctant to have more of what they call color revolutions, In Georgia, they had a Rose Revolution in 2003, Orange Revolution in Ukraine 2005, Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan 2004, Tulip in Kyrgyzstan 2005. So Putin is scared to death of these things. And of course now you see Russians who've been quiescent for a number of years now mounting large demonstrations in Russia. So I think Putin is concerned that the Arab Spring might be a success and might put more pressure on his, what he calls sovereign democracy, which is really an authoritarian form of democracy.
So would it be fair to say the argument about where the West armed Libyan soldiers, troops, the anti-Gaddafi, but there's been criticism that we are not doing that to Syria. But my understanding was there is no organized, like there was in Libya, group, is that right or wrong, that you can arm against the Assad regime?
That's correct. It's changing. You had the people around Benghazi who were always uneasy with Tripoli before, so it was easier to have a more unified opposition in Libya. In Syria, the Syrian National Council and the Free Syrian Army actually have been on different wavelengths for a while. So a lot of what the U.S. has been doing has been working with Turkey and some other Europeans and Arabs, including the Sunni supporters like Saudi, to encourage the Syrian opposition to become more unified and more responsible. U.S. is afraid to put weapons in there, partially because it's such complex, you don't know how it's going to come out, but partly because you're not sure how they're going to use the weapons or who's going to use the weapons. So efforts are being made to try to improve unified opposition, and I think there's been a fair amount of success in that, but it's ongoing. Yes?
Sorry, I wanted to ask another Syria question too. With the events over the weekend, with the Turkish jet getting shut down here, is that going to expedite the U.S. and the rest of the world getting involved in Syria, do you think, or will that have any effect?
So can you say the
Over
first?
the weekend, wasn't there it was one of the things I caught the headline, so you maybe can expand on the details. Wasn't there like a Turkish plane shot down?
A Turkish F-4 Phantom was shot down. According to the Turks, it inadvertently strayed over Syrian territory, but when it was shot down, it was over international waters in the Mediterranean Sea. That's a fairly minor event. It won't have much impact. The real issue there for Turkey is, and international communities, do you create a zone that's protected, if you will, so the Syrian refugees, Syrian fighters could go into that zone and be protected. That would mean providing air cover for that zone, as well as ground support. So that could require ground troops, it could require air troops. Turkey and the West haven't come to that point yet, but that's sort of where people are edging. Okay, the issues we've talked about so far have been regional situation, and those generally tend to be the biggest part of diplomacy and international affairs. But functional issues that cut across countries are also very big issues. Remember earlier I mentioned the book by Joe Nye and Bob Cohen, Transnational Affairs, in the mid-'70s, which gave more emphasis to this. These issues, these functional issues, have become more important. Environment, particularly climate change, has been a big issue in which progress is not being made much. Law of the Sea Treaty was negotiated in the 70s. It's been revised later. The U.S. still has not ratified it, but the Obama administration is now exploring taking it up to the Senate for ratification in the lame duck session after the election. International fishing is always a big deal, particularly between the U.S. and Canada, and the U.S. and Latin America has always been interesting. Non-proliferation, so Iran and North Korea are the hard cases, but there are a lot of other challenges, and there's a big effort to try to strengthen international treaties of one kind or another. For example, there's a UN Resolution 1540, which criminalizes, well, it calls on states to criminalize under their own criminal codes proliferation-related activities for nuclear, biological weapons, things like that, and components. Refugees, the U.S. has always been a strong supporter of international refugees. The UN High Commission on Refugees, UNHCR, the U.S. has always given a lot of money. for that. As you've had lots of conflicts all over the world, there are always lots of refugees. Consular, this is protection of American citizens abroad. Whether you lose your passport, get locked up in a jail, and then issuing of visas to foreigners to come to the United States. That's become much more an automated process now, and a lot of it is outsourced to private companies, if you will, who provide visa support information to foreigners that want to apply, and then they pay for it on a kind of user fee basis, because the demand to come to the U.S. for various reasons is quite high. Health is a big issue. Antibiotic-resistant strains of tuberculosis, for example, are a challenge in some parts of the country, including the Russian area that I'm familiar with, but there are other areas as well. International efforts to eradicate polio, I think that effort pretty much succeeded, although I think there's still a few challenges. But malaria is a much bigger killer than HIV/AIDS or anything else. So there's more momentum now to take on malaria as a worldwide health priority. Trade, North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada, U.S., Mexico. Remember President Obama in the campaign to become president said he would revise NAFTA. Well, in fact, he hasn't revised NAFTA. NAFTA is a very good agreement. It's been economically beneficial for all three countries. We've just concluded free trade pacts with Colombia, South Korea, Panama, I think. Used to be the U.S. would try through broad international negotiations to get everyone to lower tariffs and non-tariff barriers. A non-tariff barrier can be some kind of a restriction on importing something, like mad cow disease, beef because of mad cow disease, stuff like that. So to do that on a global basis, a lot of the momentum has gone out of that in recent years. So countries are concluding more free trade agreements on bilateral bases. Or in the context of European, they admit more members because it's free trade within the European Union. Monetary, the euro crisis, I guess you're going to be hearing about the euro crisis. The eurozone is not going to get well until it expels Greece. Greece has lied to its eurozone part. Eurozone are the 17 countries in the European Union. The European Union has 27 countries. I think that's right. 17 of them use the euro, the common currency. Greece, for years, has lied to its eurozone partners about its national accounts. It has refused to fulfill conditions for previous borrowing from the European Central Bank. Now it's asking for more borrowing, and the new government that was just elected Tuesday has said in the last couple of days that they want to postpone austerity measures. So they're essentially asking for more money from Germans and the other strong countries without even fulfilling conditions for previous borrowing. Greeks have a widespread aversion to paying taxes. So Greece is more of an outlier than Spain or Italy, for example. Spain or Italy are troubled. Ireland and Portugal have had troubles too and have had bailouts. But Greece is really the outlier in terms of just, thumbing their noses to the eurozone, but demanding more money. And Mrs. Merkel has resisted that. Spain, over the weekend, or today, is asking the eurozone to lend $125 or so billion directly to its banks. It has a number of failed banks, or close to failed banks. But the debt to GDP ratio in Spain is already, I think, over 100% or something like that. What the Spanish government wants is not to have that money go to the Spanish government, which it would give to its banks, and the Spanish government would have to issue what's called sovereign guarantee to the eurozone. It wants the money to go directly to Spanish banks so that the Spanish official debt to GDP ratio doesn't go up. And Mrs. Merkel has said over the last couple of days, wait a minute, I don't control banks in Spain. So if we lend them money and they go belly up, I have no, what we call in the U.S. supervision and regulatory powers over banks. And Mrs. Merkel's saying, that's crazy. And she's right. So there are troubles in the eurozone, but they're not going to make any progress until they expel Greece, and that's just my personal view. The media last week, before the elections, and Tuesday in Greece said, this election's really going to be important. No, it wasn't important. Whichever way it came out. Because the new Democracy Party that came to power, the sort of more centrist party, as soon as they came to power, they said, okay, we want to postpone austerity measures, we want to, there were two other things they wanted to do. Basically to reduce austerity, even though they're not abiding by conditions for previous borrowing. So it's pretty much the agenda of the Syriza, the leftist party that said that it was going to tear up the bailout deal with the eurozone countries. So somehow eurozone's got to begin getting healthy, and it's not going to begin getting healthy until it starts expelling countries that don't abide by conditions.
Two questions. We haven't heard much about North Korea lately. Do you think that the sanctions against them are having an effect? Do you think the government there is maybe saying, hold off, or maybe the military saying, hold off on any more tests, no more firing missiles towards Japan and things like that? And the second one, do you think that the Eurozone will expel Greece? You've given your opinion that they should. Do you think they will after this is cleared up? Do you think they will expel Greece?
Yes, because economists have said for a long time now that Greece has to default. Argentina has defaulted twice over a number of years. Greece is going to have, the debt's just too high. They can't, there's no way they can. They have a debt to GDP ratio of Greece of 200%. And then if they borrow more money, they go even above that. There's just no way they can pay that. And they can't devalue their currency because they're part of Europe. So normally when countries are in economic trouble, they devalue, or if the currency is floating, then they'll allow it to depreciate. So their exports become more competitive. Greece can't do that because they're in the euro.
So will they go off the euro?
They'll go off the euro, reinstate the drachma, and then they'll be able to devalue it and become more competitive externally. It's not prediction. North Korea. The key for North Korea is China. China has put a fair amount of pressure in the context of the six-party talks on North Korea, but they have been unwilling to put decisive pressure on for a variety of reasons. One, because they're both communist regimes, and so that they don't want to undermine communism, if you will, too much. And secondly, they're concerned about refugee flows coming out of North Korea as well. But I think the communist issue is the bigger issue.
I'll save my questions. There's another Euro crisis, so I'm going to speak this afternoon on that. So.
Okay. All right. Okay, a couple final thoughts. Diplomacy is more gray than black and white. There are good versus evil, such as Hitler, defeating Hitler and defeating Japan after the war. That was good and evil was pretty clearly defined. Soviet Union, good and evil were pretty clearly defined. President Reagan gave a speech once calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. He was absolutely right. Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, never reported that because they knew that when they were Soviet citizens knew that it was an evil system. But they never reported it. But most issues are gray. And take climate change, for example. If the U.S. Were to put much stricter controls on carbon dioxide emissions, but other countries were not to do that, then it really wouldn't have much benefit in terms of climate change, but energy costs for Americans would go up. And there would be differential impacts. People who live more in rural areas or commute longer would have greater economic pain. The way we are with the federalist system, where we have a lot of small states, but they have 2 senators, a lot of the small states tend to be rural, not all, but ours, not many of them are. Most folks are not so keen. A lot of states produce coal. They're not so keen either. I'm from West Virginia. Joe Manchin, who was the senator who replaced Robert Byrd, and the governor of West Virginia, they're both Democrats. They announced last week that they were not going to go to the Democratic National Convention. A great part of that is the Obama administration's support for cap and trade or some kind of climate change, which they see as a threat to the coal industry. Diplomacy involves compromise. While you have to retain your fundamental principles, of course, but you have to make some significant compromises. We had to do a lot of that in the Cold War because we saw the Soviet Union as a dominant threat. So, for example, there was a dictatorship in Iran under the Shah, but they allowed us to have a number of key security facilities over there and other things. There was a short-term advantage, long-term some disadvantage, but we felt a real threat in those days. Right now, we're pretty unhappy with the way Saudi Arabia deals with women's rights, but we have a lot of strategic interests. So this is a compromise, and we have to try to find a balance that takes care of all of our interests. And finally, diplomacy requires leverage. Moral leverage, for example, outrage over the indiscriminate shelling of civilians in Syria. That's probably the most powerful factor, if you will, building international support to do something about Bashar Assad. Military leverage you often have to have if you want to persuade some country that's using military power, like, say, North Korea. You have to have strong military deployments. We have a lot of soldiers and military equipment in South Korea, for example. We make quite clear that South Korea is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And then finally, economic leverage is very important. Dealing with the euro crisis, economic leverage that Germany has, for example, was enormously important there. But one way or another, diplomacy is not just sitting down and persuading people that, gee, you're right after all, I was wrong. You have to have some leverage behind it, or otherwise it doesn't work. Are we over budget, or? No. Okay. Any questions?
You talk about the leverage here. Aren't those just one of several types of things that we use in order to influence the other countries? Mm-hmm. Is the humanitarian part of that too?
Oh, okay. I included that under moral. But yes, humanitarian. So for tsunami relief, for example, we dispatched a bunch of Navy ships, provided other kinds of assistance over there. To the point now, we're using the Navy so much for humanitarian assistance that the Navy is talking about a base in Thailand, I think, maybe reconstituting a base in Thailand where we could center our humanitarian assistance for that part of the world, because between earthquakes and tsunamis and other things, we've had to do a lot of things. Earthquake in Pakistan, for example, we usually rebuilt a lot of support in Pakistan for the U.S. because we went in there with helicopters and rescued a bunch of trapped people in mountains. The support didn't last too long, but it helped. So the moral part of what we do is really very important. Religious freedom has become much more important. Now, State Department for the last 20, 30 years has an Office of Religious Freedom. We see religious freedom as important around the world in helping us achieve both realist objectives as well as unreal, idealist objectives.
So if Tehran had a major earthquake, 100,000 people, they're about dying or something, what role would the United States play under the circumstances?
The Iranians would not ask us, but we would probably say we'd offer to help. We'd ship supplies, blankets, tents, all sorts of things. There are stockpiles of these things around the world, supplies for emergencies like that. Some are under United Nations control, some are U.S., and so UN, of course, would offer. A lot of the stuff that's UN is actually U.S. provided stuff.
Probably wouldn't come directly from the United States.
We'd be happy to do it, but the Iranians would refuse it. No, we'd be happy to do it because we'd like to show the Iranians, we're in favor of the Iranian people. It's just the Iranian regime that we don't like. Okay. Yes.
I think more about Russia. I know with Putin coming back into power this year, it sort of changes the dynamics of our relations with them. Could you comment a little bit on that?
When Medvedev was a protege of Putin, and so after Putin served 2 4-year terms as president, he abided by the Russian Constitution and so promoted his protege to be president. Medvedev actually is a different kind of person. Putin was a KGB security person. Medvedev's a lawyer, and so for the 4 years that Medvedev was in power, he talked a lot more about political liberalization, important reforms in Russia and things like that. Obama struck up a good relationship with Medvedev, but he never had real power. And then when his term came up, and during his term, Medvedev proposed to the Duma, the legislature, that the term of president be increased to 6 years. So when Medvedev's 4 years came up, Putin said, okay, I'll come back to power. And it was clear that Medvedev wanted to stay in and was crestfallen by this. But Putin was the real power. He's back now for 6 years and hopes to be there another 6 years. But the outrage of ordinary people in Russia about when Putin just announced that he was going to come back, there was no open political discussion in Russia or whatever. That was the first thing. And then the stolen election in December got people fired up. Usually stolen elections are things that tend to kick off revolutions, color revolutions that happen in Georgia and Ukraine. There's been an issue in Egypt as well. So now you have a lot of people out there demonstrating in Moscow especially, but even in some other cities. It's still uncertain how it's going to come out. Generally, in the foreign policy world, you tend to look at countries of how much civil society do they have in terms of independent people who own private property. People who own their own private property are more willing to take independent stances than people who rent their apartments from the government, for example. So generally people thought, for example, that Ukraine has more civil society than Russia, and so they had their Orange Revolution, but now they voted in a guy who's taking them backward, and yet the people are not out in the streets. So there's some puzzlement as to why that's the case. The revolution that undid the Soviet Union was in 1991. It was in Moscow, not a countrywide thing, but in Moscow. But then the Russians seemed quiescent. And through history, they've seemed more politically docile. They've had very little political experience over the course of history, and they've been brutalized, especially in the Soviet period. So this is an experimental situation now. Putin looks like he has overplayed his hand, and my guess is he's going to have to make some reforms or otherwise face increasing pressure. But once you start making reforms, then you increase people's expectations. And revolutions usually occur when the gap between reality and expectations widens. So not when people are most downtrodden, but when usually things start improving, expectations are raised, and then, yes.
I've noticed that is it possible because Russians are wealthier now and they're traveling the world, so the idea of putting them back into that Soviet box is just a little more difficult for Putin? Because I go places and, there people say, well, gee, the Russians bought this and that, and, from the Caribbean all over. And it's quite interesting. This is something you've never seen before. And with their wealth, it seems like they're expanding their wings. Yep. And once you expand your wings, it's very difficult for you to put you back into that box that you had always been in.
That's exactly right. Some scholars argue that you can look at GDP per capita and get some idea of how liberal the regime is going to be, how democratic it's going to be. And they argue that the GDP per capita now in Russia is too high to put them back in the box. It wouldn't be specifically a Soviet box, but it would be an authoritarian box. Yep. Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
Do you see Russia doing like Great Britain did at once? It was like king of the world, and now it's gotten smaller and smaller in power and influence. Isn't that going to happen the same thing with Russia?
It was painful for Great Britain to adapt to loss of empire. Remember, Winston Churchill said he wasn't elected to preside over the loss of the empire. It's been hard for Russia to lose its empire, if you will. Putin once said 6-7 years ago that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. So you kind of understand where he is from. And there's a long tradition in Russia of the people, including back in the Russian Empire before the Bolshevik Soviets, of Russia being seen as an independent great power, and for the people willing to pay a price, including deprivation of quality of their life, in order to maintain Russia's independent power. The Russian church argued that decay in the West caused Rome and Constantinople to fall or to lose their moral authority, but only Russia, what they call the Third Rome, Moscow, only Russia has preserved true Christian principles, and therefore really should be the center of the church. So they have an exaggerated conception of themselves historically as a great power, although they've played some important roles. And a good one to remember, which is now in the news, in World War II, in the West, we never faced more than 1/3 of the German armed forces. They had 2/3 of them on the Eastern Front. So we like to think in the West, when you look at films and stuff, that we won, we defeated. It was the Soviets who did more to defeat. There was a battle at Kursk, which was the one that finally turned the tide. There were 3,000 tanks in that battle. Nothing like that ever happened, the Battle of Bulge or anything in the West. So they've played some really important roles. And now they're finding it hard to come to grips with the fact that a lot of if you want to be a great power today, you need a lot of soft power. They have no friends, they have very little soft power, they don't have a system that people want to emulate. And of course this is happening in the Arab world now too. These Arab potentates don't have soft power. The young people are more educated, they're more in touch with social media. The soft power ideas are coming from freer countries or freer parts of the world than the dictatorial parts of the world. This is a real problem for Russia, and it's a big reason why China does so much to try to control the internet in China, because they don't have enough soft power. Confucianism and communism are not enough to engage the youth in China.
I have one more question on the 20% of the U.S. debt being controlled by China. Mm-hmm. I keep hearing a lot of people screaming and saying it's going to be the downfall, to loan that money out to all these foreign countries. What's your take on all that?
Well, it certainly increases the dependence. When the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Timothy Geithner, was over there a month or two ago, when the Treasury Secretary goes over there, he doesn't go as a supplicant, but he goes as a friend to China. They got a lot of power. We borrowed too much money. We were living beyond our means for much too long. We were collecting taxes at much lower rates than federal expenditures. I think taxes have been around 18-19%. Expenditures are now around 24% of GDP, and that gap is being made up by borrowing. So we did it to ourselves. So it is a risk factor. And the level of our debt to GDP is a risk factor itself, but having large chunks of it belong to China. Now, there was a time when we were concerned that the euro was going to be so credible that the Chinese, if we were too tough on the Chinese, they might switch out of dollar-denominated assets and go to euro assets. That's not quite a challenge right now. Yes?
In your discussion of functional issues, I missed arms control dialogue. Could you speak about that a little?
Okay. Arms control exists in several levels. So then the grandest level is strategic arms control. And this is intercontinental range missiles. So missiles that we have deployed up in North Dakota, for example, that can strike Russia directly. It is submarines that launch ballistic missiles. So the Trident submarines are the ones that we have. And then bombers that have intercontinental range. Those are called strategic nuclear arms. So with the SALT I agreement in 1972 and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty also 72, up through the START agreement in the Reagan first Bush era, Bush 41 era, and then START 2 and now New START, we have tried to control some of that and start reducing that weapon. At the very bottom end of weaponry, if you will, anti-mining, landmines. There was a groundswell of protest in the 1990s against landmines because they used them all the wars in the poor states around the world. They used, and the traditional landmines don't automatically fizzle out after a period of time. More sophisticated ones will automatically just deactivate over a period of time. So they're all over the world, and you have guerrilla armies deploying landmines, but they're not keeping maps of where the mines are. So there was an anti-landmine convention that was negotiated. In the middle, you have conventional arms in Europe. There's conventional forces in Europe, CFE treaty that was negotiated that is really no longer active now. There are various efforts in certain parts of the world to declare themselves nuclear-free zones, that they won't have nuclear weapons. So there's a treaty of Tlatelolco in Latin America for that example. So there are a bunch of different activities. But the basic idea is to try to put some political and even legal controls on what weapons, on weaponry. The real issue, though, is not so much the weapons themselves, it's the kind of state. If you have an aggressive, ideologically aggressive state that has a weapon, it's very different. So I think I use an example in here on one of these, artillery. Artillery now is being used in Syria to shell rebellious cities and kill innocent people. You know, that's outrageous. But the U.S. deploys artillery, and so does South Korea, in South Korea to deter a North Korean attack. So the issue is not whether artillery is good or bad, it's really how it's used. Sure. Anything more?
The drones. Good, bad for foreign policy, for U.S. security, long-term implications.
Well, you've been reading the papers recently. Just in the last couple months, two issues have come up now about whether the U.S. has unleashed something it shouldn't have unleashed. One are drone attacks, where you have missiles on the drones that kill people. And those missiles, by the way, the U.S. is making them smaller and smaller as the accuracy has improved to reduce collateral damage. And so there's been remarkably little collateral damage, actually, from those attacks. And then the other is the Stuxnet cyber virus, which is aimed at the Iranian nuclear facilities. Through an accident, the Stuxnet was supposed to stay in the Iranian nuclear facilities and kind of just disappear so that the Iranians would never know it was there. But some of it got out of the internet. And so there's a big debate now, there's a fierce debate over the last couple months about whether the U.S. should be using those drones the way they are and whether we unleashed a monster with Stuxnet that we should not have done. The choice for the technology determines so many things. So you may want things to go back in a box. For example, after World War II, one of the scientists at Los Alamos who invented the atomic bomb, including Oppenheimer, who headed the effort, they were opposed to developing a hydrogen bomb or a nuclear bomb, where an atomic primary is used to detonate a secondary, and nuclear weapons are hundreds to thousands of times more powerful than an atomic weapon. So Oppenheimer was opposed to developing the super hydrogen bomb after World War II. But Truman said no, so we're going to develop it. And Truman was right, because Stalin would have developed it as they got the technology. There was no question. So Oppenheimer was a brilliant physicist, but he didn't know much about the Soviet Union. Truman had better political instincts there. So we've had this issue come up a number of times about should technology somehow be kept in the box, but you just can't keep it in the box. So the question then is responsible use. I would argue that Obama has been very skillful and appropriate in using drones to take out terrorist leaders who are trying to kill U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and now using them in Somalia and Yemen as well. The Stuxnet, if the Stuxnet virus helped keep Israel or the U.S. from launching a bigger military attack on Iran to stop its nuclear program, and that seems to be part of the reason, then that was probably a more humane thing to do than launching a broader military attack. Certainly, people would die on a larger military attack, and that really didn't happen with Stuxnet.
Is that a abuse of presidential power? in the sense of those type of military strikes? I mean, is it changing the face of war and decision making? And I know it saves our troops' lives and all, but it does step up the policy of the president being able to do those types of things without consent of Congress.
No, the Congress is always briefed on this stuff.
I know they say they're not, but I know.
Oh, no, Nancy Pelosi once said she wasn't, but she was. The Congress is fully in that, and they appropriate the money. All Congress has to do is say, no money in this appropriation will be used for armed drone activity or for developing cyber offensive stuff.
So the foolishness of talking heads is just that they are aware that this is being done. It's just politically expedient for them to disavow or challenge. Or
with the drone strikes, there hasn't been much disavowal. Actually, hasn't been much on the cyber either. There are a few people kind of on the left end of the political spectrum who are unhappy about it. But generally, there hasn't been much. Where you get this is in the issue of the torture memos that the George W. Bush administration used, where the Office of Legal Counsel and the Justice Department that makes legal policy for the executive branch said that doing what CIA did was okay. And so CIA used those legal memos to justify doing what it was doing. And then after the fact, a bunch of people said, well, wait a minute, that actually constituted torture. So John McCain is one of those, for example, who argued that. So there is sometimes where you get this sort of presidential versus. And that was where Nancy Pelosi at one point, a couple of years ago, when Leon Panetta, shortly after he became CIA director, said, oh, well, I wasn't briefed on some of this torture stuff. And then Panetta pulled out the briefing, the notes and stuff like that, and publicly, to the surprise of many people, because they're both California Democrats, said, no, she was briefed on that, and then she was quiet after that. So the briefing of Congress is usually very intimate. If it's very sensitive, it's done in what's called 8 eyes, which are, not 8 eyes, but 8 people. So the majority, minority leader in the Senate, and the majority, a minority leader of the appropriate committee, whether it's armed forces or intelligence, and then the same thing on the House. So they know. There are no secrets from Congress.
So in the case of Valley North?
Oh, that was an abuse, yeah.
In the beginning of a new type of warfare and a new type of policy making in this country.
No, that wasn't the beginning. That was an aberration, and we've never done anything like that. In fact, we have stronger laws and policies.
On Libya, rather, it wasn't a presidential decision about war using a different type of warfare.
I'm not aware of anything. Everything that's been done since then has been to make sure those kinds of activities. Well, I was part of the cleanup brigade in the White House after the Ollie North affair, and you may remember, some of you are older, remember a secretary named Fawn Hall, who was Ollie North's secretary?
Oh, yes.
One of my responsibilities was to reorganize the intelligence section, the way that documents were handled in the National Security Council, so that future Fawn Hall could not take an intelligence document out and retype it and put it back in the files. So lots of measures were taken, and the procedures are very disciplined. In that case, what you had was a renegade CIA director in William Casey. We haven't had renegade CIA directors since then. Hopefully we won't again. Yes?
I wondered, you sort of alluded to David Sanger's book when you were talking about the SIXNet virus getting out. And he's certainly when that book got released a couple of weeks ago, there was a big about whether somehow secrets had been leaked. I wondered what your opinion was about whether there were too many people talking about things they shouldn't have been.
Yes, no, that's true, and it is true. And this is also a very big issue now about whether should interactions with the press that are inappropriate by federal government employees be criminalized in ways that there are enough restrictions in place now and measures that probably don't need to do that, but Congress is looking at that now. Leaks have been a problem in Washington for a very long period of time. Remember, some of you older remember the Pentagon Papers were published and ultimately went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said yes, that could go ahead. So there have been a lot of leaks through the years, but recently there have been a few that have been awkward. Abu Ghraib, there have been a lot of us. I didn't know that this is really fundamentally different from before. And what David Sanger revealed was essentially it was a U.S.-Israeli cooperation on Stuxnet and this larger flame. And everybody presumed that was kind of the case. Anyway, the contact party said
So you just think it's business as usual?
yeah, it's sort of business as usual. Usually things don't leak in Washington unless they're politically controversial.
Yeah.
If there's no controversy, then generally things don't leak so much. And most things in national security usually don't tend to be so partisan like that. Okay, I think I'm probably over the budget. Yeah. All right, thanks very much.